Hello, friends, and welcome to the third episode of America and the Signs of the Times. In this podcast series, we're looking at events that have been happening in our country and the world in the past few years, weeks, and days through the lens of Bible prophecy. What do these scriptures show about our future? What do they say about our present? Is America identified in scriptures about the last days? It is, and I'm going to show you how. But first, I'm going to tell you a story about something that happened long ago. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. They left England 2 months ago on a small, cramped sailing ship. There were 102 of them, with 40 crew members stuffed together on the stormy, raging North Atlantic on a ship whose name spoke of a calmer, more peaceful world, the Mayflower. John Howland was one of them. He was called an indentured servant, which meant that he was a voluntary slave who would work for his master and after 5 years be given freedom for services rendered. Suddenly, that didn't matter anymore because he was going to drown in the freezing, storm-tossed seas. He was on the deck when the ship lurched to one side, throwing John overboard. In panic, he fought to the surface, only to see the Mayflower swiftly gliding past him in the howling wind and the horror-stricken faces of crew members staring down at him. He saw a rope in the water being dragged behind the ship and grabbed for it frantically before it disappeared with the Mayflower. The crewmen who were watching this unfolding tragedy quickly grabbed the line and hauled John Howland back on board. This near-death experience certainly left a lifelong impression on him, but it didn't stop him or his companions from their goal, to begin a new life on a new continent and build a new kind of country. They succeeded. And many, many years later, one of John Howland's descendants was elected the 41st President of the United States, George H.W. Bush. This is part of the story of that country that John risked his life for and how it figures in the book of Revelation and the end times. In our last episode, we looked at Babylon the Great, a city of wealth and influence that is described in the book of Revelation. We ended with a question. Does this country look familiar? Today we will answer that question, and the answer might trouble you, especially because of what the future holds for that country. I want to be honest with you. In looking at these things, I sometimes feel like I'm telling a very interesting story with all sorts of twists and turns and surprises. That's wrong because the book of Revelation is a warning, and you need to see and accept that. God is warning us of what is to come, and He's showing me and hopefully you, that these events have already begun. And I won't stop emphasizing what Jesus said is of the utmost importance. In Matthew 24:6, He said, "Let not your hearts be troubled." Then in the parables of Matthew 24 and 25, He tells us how to prepare. I'll go into much more detail later of what He said, but it comes down to this. Like never before in your life, be a wholehearted follower of Jesus. Put aside sin, bad habits, and excuses. Submit to His dealings in your life, obey His commandments, and love Him and His people without reservation. That is how you are to prepare. So could America be Babylon the Great? Certainly the descriptions of Babylon could easily fit the U.S. In the history of the world, there is no country as rich and with as diverse and multinational a population as the U.S. In the past, different empires have dominated parts of the world, Asia, Europe, Africa, and so on, but there's never been a country with a truly worldwide reach where people from everywhere can come and enjoy freedom and material success like the U.S. Look it up in your history books. There have been great empires in every area of the world. The Roman, Egyptian, or Babylonian empires, the British Empire, the Aztecs or the Mayas, the Qing dynasty in China or Genghis Khan, and others. But their power was limited to their parts of the globe. America is very different, and what made her different shows that no other country in the world has equaled America, and no country ever will. What happened that turned this huge, undeveloped continent into the most powerful nation of all time? It's probably been a long time since you sat in your high school history class, so find your desk, stop talking, and let's take a look at what happened 250 years ago. The people who arrived on the shores of North America and became Americans were changed as much by the environment as by anything else. They all came from old established countries with towns and cities, with streets and roads that were ruled by kings, the nobility, church authorities, and the very rich. Those countries had traditions, laws, and jails that made sure that those groups stayed in power. The citizen of England literally belonged to the king. And as a side note, that's why the War of 1812 between England and the U.S. was fought. The British Navy, busy fighting a war with Napoleon of France, needed more sailors for their ships. They would stop American vessels on the high seas, and if they found an Englishman in the crew, they would seize him and put him in their navy. They did that because, as an Englishman, he belonged to the king. When the Pilgrims arrived in Massachusetts, or the colonists in Jamestown, or the many other places where the new arrivals stepped off their boats, they discovered that their lives in this new land were going to be entirely different from the ones they had left. In a word, there was nothing waiting for them except unlimited forests inhabited by strange natives who weren't always happy to see them. They also found hardship from disease and starvation. Of the original Pilgrims from the Mayflower who landed with John Howland on Cape Cod in 1620, nearly half died in the first winter. This strange land changed the first settlers. There were no welcoming committees, no stores ready to sell them food or farming equipment, no roads on which they could travel from settlement to settlement. They couldn't depend on the king, army, or police to protect them. There were no trade guilds, no wagon manufacturers, no gunsmiths or blacksmiths. There were no churches, schools, or hospitals, and none of those things were going to magically appear. If they wanted them, they had to do the work to make them happen. And they did. They had to take the initiative to create a society that didn't exist before. In many cases, they found that the old ways of doing something back home wouldn't work in this new world. They began to invent newer, better, and faster methods for farming and doing all the many other jobs that needed to be done. But the Pilgrims did something else that they had never done before. As the Mayflower approached land, they gathered together on the rocking, pitching ship and wrote a set of rules that outlined how they would govern themselves. The Mayflower Compact established a self-governing society that would obey the laws that they had passed. In short, they created a government of the people, not one dictated by the whims or mood of a king. The American colonists were also readers. Literacy was higher in the American colonies than anywhere else in the world. It has been estimated that by the time of the Revolution, close to 85 to 90% of Americans had learned to read. The main reason was so that everyone could read the Bible. It was that foundational book that was the basis for their freedoms and later the writing of the U.S. Constitution. The common man was a reader, and that was an important influence on the forming of America. Another element that proved to be even more important to this new land was the conviction that God had sent them to this unmapped territory to create a new type of society, where men would be free to live the kind of freedom that the Bible talked about. They saw their settlement as a city on a hill, a shining light of the gospel that would be governed by God's laws and also bring his message to the original natives. That's a rough outline of how America started, and there's much more to the story. But now we fast forward to the year 1789. The Americans had won their independence from England 6 years before. The Founding Fathers met in Philadelphia and completed a document of government that would amaze the rest of the world, because something like it had never been done before. For the first time, citizens of a nation, not a king or a tyrant, could decide how they wanted to be governed. The writers of the Constitution believed that the rights of man came from God, not from a government of men. They had studied the history of the world and the different kinds of governments that had been created and imposed on peoples and nations. They also read philosophers like John Locke or William Blackstone, who proposed a new way of governing that had never been tried, that of democratic representation, where the people chose the kind of government they wanted and who their leaders would be. The purpose of that document wasn't to show Americans what their rights were. It was to restrain the power of any one person or group to control the government and use it for their own power and enrichment. They were excited because they saw the possibility. a truly free people, and a form of government that prevented oppression by powerful individuals or forces. And that's what they created. The result was the first country in the history of the world where people were truly free. A land of generous, dynamic, and motivated people who didn't want the handouts of a king, but were ready to build their own destiny. They also enjoyed the unifying benefit of having a single country with a single language whose land mass was greater than Europe with its over 200 languages. They had an entire continent in front of them. Millions of square miles of rich farmland, forests, and mountains of every kind of mineral like gold, silver, iron, copper, and aluminum. Numerous long rivers for transporting goods to markets, and many large harbors to facilitate trade with the rest of the world. This is important. Americans today take freedom for granted, but such an enormous land could only have been developed successfully to the extent that it has been by a free people. Tyrannical governments, where power is held in the hands of only a few, who plan and dictate growth, who pile layers of laws and regulations on development, could never do that. And so with all that freedom and energy, America continued to grow from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific. People from all over the world, first from Western Europe, then Southern and Eastern Europe, Asia and South America, came to the shores of a land that promised freedom and prosperity to whoever was willing to work for it. Up until 1807, when Congress passed a law against importing them, an estimated 500,000 Africans were brought to America as slaves. By 1890, only a little more than 100 years after the Constitution was written by the original 13 colonies, the U.S. had become the largest economy in the world. By the early 20th century, the U.S. had become a world power and used its strength in World War I to help England and France defeat Germany. That status was confirmed without a doubt in World War II, when America's industrial might and military aid to Russia and the United Kingdom brought victory over German aggression, while at the same time beating Japan in the Pacific almost single-handedly. At the end of World War II, a new term was invented to describe her, a superpower. America had become the most powerful nation in the world, and because of her technology and wealth, the most powerful nation in all of history. But our world is in sin, and no creation of man can protect itself from the sickness and death that sin creates. The shiny ideals of the American Constitution, which for the next 200 years were copied by countries all over the world, couldn't last. Slavery and the forced relocation of Indian tribes showed the dark side of humanity that couldn't be held down. Businesses and legislators worked together to create unfair laws that only benefited political parties and special interest groups of every stripe. More and more, politicians began to take money from one group and give it to another, all in the interest of keeping their power and adding to their own wealth. The greatest country the world had ever seen started with a people and government that had a Christian foundation, but gradually changed to one with man-centered philosophies and actions. Christian traditions remained, but God was less and less a part of that equation. Still, today, America remains the strongest, most influential country in the world, both an economic and military superpower. With President Trump's vision and goals, the U.S. could become even more dominant. At the same time, we see that his manner and methods are resented by many in the world. But the world's resentment and envy of America go way back in time. The exciting, explosive growth from its beginning and its success and freedoms amazed the rest of the world. They felt like they should have the riches and respect instead of the new kid on the block. Now, if this is too much history, don't get impatient. You'll soon see how, in spite of the noble desires and actions of the Founding Fathers, man's nature was able to change the direction of the greatest country the world had ever seen. So let's put down our history books and look at Revelation chapters 17 and 18 and all the descriptions of Babylon the Great, which seem to be fulfilled in the U.S., except for one of them. In Revelation 18:24, the charge is made, "In her was found the blood of prophets and of the saints and of all who have been killed on the earth." This is troubling. We can relate to the descriptions of Babylon in the U.S. because we're living in the time when those things seem to fit. But the U.S. being guilty of the blood of the prophets and saints? No. Up to now, America's been a haven for those who follow Jesus. There's been no persecution. It seems that the roots of Babylon the Great go much further back than 1789, 1776, or even 1492, because the entire world system has been dying since the sin of Adam, which brought death to the world. The world is daily spiraling deeper and deeper toward destruction. It says, "In her was found the blood of the saints and prophets and all who were killed on the earth." So we're obviously speaking of a Babylon that is both a current physical entity, the United States, and a spiritual entity that has existed since the sin of Adam's rebellion. And if we're talking about the spirit of Babylon, then that includes the persecution of God's people since the beginning of time, including up to today and in all the world, not just in the U.S. This is the heart of the matter. The last verse, which is Revelations 18:24 about Babylon's doom, reveals that it's more than just a country at a specific point in time which is being punished. It's the spiritual root of rebellion, sin, and murder that go back deep into the creation, all the way back to Eden. It has taken possession of human nature and has found its ultimate expression in America. The Jesus People revival of the 1960s and 70s resulted in the greatest number of Christian conversions in the history of the U.S., but it failed to stop the downward fall of American society. The signs are all there. The sacrifice of babies for personal or financial gain and protection was one reason God commanded the Israelites to exterminate the earlier inhabitants of the Promised Land. America has sacrificed over 60 million babies since 1973. America has become a culture that encourages young boys and girls to undergo surgical mutilation of their bodies, telling them that they are now the opposite sex. On the basis of that, perverted men are allowed in women's locker rooms and sports. Homosexuality is celebrated by politicians, schools, and entertainers with Gay Pride Month and lewd gay parades down Main Street. Pornography is available to anyone of any age who has a cell phone or a laptop. Radical antisocial philosophy is being pushed in the schools, and youth is being taught that there are no absolute truths, which is another way of saying there is no God. Violent anti-Jewish riots have rocked Ivy League schools and other universities and colleges, with rioters calling for the destruction of Israel. Self-fulfillment has become the ultimate goal of both adults and youth. Indeed, all this couldn't be stopped. The world was and is cursed. Some of those things have been resisted and repealed, but that won't last for long. The core of the country has become rotten. And so, sin and death will eventually take full control in the U.S., putting the followers of Jesus at great risk. How closely do Babylon the Great and America fit each other? Well, let's compare them. First, Babylon the Great is enormously rich. We read in Revelation 18:16 through 19, "O great city, dressed in fine linen, purple and scarlet, and glittering with gold, was there ever a city like this?" America alone currently accounts for over 25% of the total world's gross domestic product and is the richest country the world has ever known. The bottom 5% of Americans have incomes higher than most people who have ever lived. Babylon the Great is composed of peoples, multitudes, nations, and languages. Revelation 17:15 says, "The waters you saw, where the prostitute sits, are peoples, multitudes, nations, and languages." Currently, there are people from around 100 different countries that now call America home. Much of the rest of the world became rich through trade with Babylon. Chapter 18, verses 11 through 13. In 2024, the U.S. was the second largest exporter and the largest merchandise importer in the world. In Revelations 18:7, Babylon says, "I sit as queen," meaning she rules the world. She doesn't say that she is a queen, but she is the queen. She alone rules the world. The U.S. has the most powerful military and the largest economy. Through military and economic threats, the U.S. can force compliance with American policies from the rest of the world. Babylon's wealth can only be maintained in a climate of peace. She is strong enough militarily to do that. Trump's plan for the economic success of the U.S. depends on world peace. While smaller wars will undoubtedly continue, the world will also see the ending of conflicts that threaten another major war, at least for a while. Babylon influences the culture of the world, chapter 18, verse 13. American culture, the influence of Hollywood, music, consumerism, the internet, social media, and fast food chains, and so on, are more widespread than that of any other nation. People in Europe, Asia, Africa, and the rest of the world wear t-shirts with logos from American sports teams and products. American movies are shown worldwide. Chapter 18, verse 7 says she is confident of the future. She says, "I will never mourn." During the National Security Strategy Conference in 2025, President Trump stated, "In the years ahead, we will make America safer, richer, freer, greater, and more powerful than ever before." The Tower of Babel, the precursor to Babylon and Babylon the Great, was enabled to work toward its goal because the whole earth had one language and one speech. Today, 4,000 years after the Tower of Babel, the whole earth can once more communicate in just one language, English, and that is the language of Babylon the Great, the United States. Babylon the Great is the title given to the city-kingdom in Revelation. We need to be reminded that these things aren't metaphorical fairy tales. They're really going to happen, and maybe soon. When the rest of the world sees the destruction of Babylon, the U.S., they will be horrified and acknowledge that there has never been a country like the U.S. Think of the context in which her greatness is described, the end times. When the witnesses of her destruction ask, "Was there ever a great city like this?" it is implied that from the viewpoint of the time that they live in, as they look back on the history of the world, the answer is no, there never was a city or a country like her. And finally, we read in the book of Daniel that the ancient Babylon was destroyed in one night. Today, atomic bombs and radiation now have the ability to fulfill a 2,000-year-old prophecy. The fate of America could be sealed in 1 hour. How could the beast and its allies, the 10 horns kings, attack Babylon, the U.S., and destroy it in 1 hour? The answer would be a nuclear holocaust like the world has never seen before and never could imagine. The average nuclear bomb today is 80 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. An attack on America by determined enemies would comprise more than a few bombs of that size. There could be hundreds or more than 1,000 aimed at every population center, power plant, dam, military base, and so on. America and her 347 million people would cease to exist in 1 hour. Nuclear blast and the resulting radiation would make the United States and much of Canada and Mexico uninhabitable for hundreds of years. That means that those who survive the blasts won't live longer than a few more months. Revelation 17:16 says, "They will bring her to ruin and leave her naked. They will eat her flesh and burn her with fire." Is this possible? America is the greatest military power that ever existed. Can't we defend ourselves against any attack? According to the National Security Strategy of 2017, the U.S. currently has 44 anti-ballistic missiles designed to defend the entire country from nuclear attack, and they only have a 50% interception success rate. There's bound to be confusion over my claim that the U.S. is Babylon the Great. As humans, we tend to adjust to changes in our world because we're always trying to achieve a stable, normal, and quiet life that's safe. As long as we're comfortable, then we can ignore what's been happening around us. But could you imagine if 10, 20, or 30 years ago, you had a clear picture of what the world of today would look like, what you would think about it? You wouldn't believe that these things could happen in America. You would be shaken to the core. It's undeniable that with people like John Howland, the Pilgrims, and our founding fathers, that America started with idealism based on a relationship with God and His Bible. But what's also obvious is that the spirit of Babylon slowly integrated itself and was absorbed into what became the greatest country the world has ever seen. We might ask ourselves, how can America be destroyed when there are still so many good Christians here who are doing good things? When Judah was taken captive by Babylon and its people deported to that foreign country, we see the judgment of God on corrupt leaders and a people who had turned their backs on God and lived immoral, godless lives. But not everyone was like that, because you also had people like Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Ezra, Nehemiah, and countless others who didn't follow the sins of the kings and the people of Judah. They honored God with their lives, but suffered the same punishment as the others. The spirit of Babylon has taken the one country in the world with the strongest foundation and the greatest potential the world has ever seen and poured all her temptations, tricks, and lies into it to cause it to become the ultimate expression of her nature. And as Revelation tells us, it will be destroyed. In view of all the prophecies about the end times, beginning with the restoration of Israel, the U.S. seems to be the piece of the puzzle where Babylon the Great fits. Well, this wasn't your typical history class, was it? Revelation was written 2,000 years ago for a time in the future about things that have already happened. That sounds confusing. But in Isaiah 46:10, the Lord says, I make known the end from the beginning, from ancient times what is still to come. You can say that he sees the end from the beginning and the beginning from the end. I believe that the Lord is telling us that the time has come. Next week, we're going to watch as the Lamb begins to open the seals. The actual physical effects of the open seals aren't a secret. The technologies are already here, and it's no great stretch to apply them to the world we're living in today. You won't want to miss this because, like I said, God showed these things to the Apostle John so that you and I would know and be prepared. Much of what I'm sharing here is based on the book War and Rumors of War, What Christians Need to Know About the Coming Days. It's available from Amazon Books. Feel free to leave a comment and let me know what you think about these things. And please share this podcast with others. It's a serious warning to the church that we need to prepare. God bless you, and I'll see you next week.